Ja, ved navns nævnelse er det hele. Så vi går i gang. Hello everyone, and welcome to this course about Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales. My name is Torsten Bøgh Thomsen, and I am a PhD student, and with me I've got Professor Jakob Bøghild. Hello. We both work at the Hans Christian Andersen Research Center here in Odense, and we will be some of the educators that you will be meeting during this course over the next couple of weeks. Today we're here to introduce you to the course and answer some of your questions. This course is mainly thought out as a peer-to-peer learning, but we do offer these 2 live sessions where you'll be able to ask us questions directly and get us to answer them. In the meantime, please feel free to discuss and debate with your fellow learners, as well as our course host, Mette Laursen, who will be hosting the course and send out weekly news mails. And the next live session like this is on November 21st. So without any further ado, I think we should just go to the questions, Jakob.
Yeah, let's begin. So the first question is from Sarah Connolly, and she asks, why do you think we are drawn to fairy tales? And
yes, I would like to start out with that. It's a very, very broad question, of course. Why are we drawn to fairy tales? And you could ask an even bigger question. You can ask, why are we drawn to literature in general? Why do we tell stories in general? And there has been several scholars of literature who has tried to answer that during the course of time. I think that one of the most basic things that you can say is that people have, all through recorded history, have always told each other stories. We don't know of a time when people were not telling stories or producing some kind of narrative. And you could say that very basically, the story or the structure of the narrative is a way to create some kind of meaning in life, project some kind of meaning into a reality that is somehow in itself meaningless. It can also be said that that's the way we understand our individual lives, that all the things that happen to us, they need to be structured, or they can be structured into some kind of cohesive line where one event follows another in some kind of causal way that makes the things give some kind of meaning. When it comes specifically to the question of literature, and especially to the question of fairy tales, fairy tales can sometimes be seen as some kind of the quintessential kind of literature. That's where you have sort of everything narrowed down into its basic components. But when you're talking about fairy tales, there is a very popular scholar called a philosopher called Susan Sontag, who's inspired by another scholar called Walter Benjamin. And her point is that when it comes to literature, it gives us what is lacking in our everyday lives, which is this reassurance that everything will unfold in some kind of linear movement that will be meaningful to us. So what literature gives us is a line of events that directly lead up to each other, where there is a climax, and after that everything is okay. So you could say that fairy tales gives us the promise that there will be a point after which everyone will live happily ever after. I think that would be my kind of...
Yeah, and sometimes they live happily ever after, and sometimes something else happens.
Yes.
And that will lead us to the next question, I think, by Valerie Plum. She asks, with so many tales to his name, that must be Andersen, of course, I wonder how many have traditional sources and how many are his own invention. It's a very good question, and it can be answered quite briefly or shortly, because only 6 or 7 of Andersen's tales are based on pre-existing folk tales. So that's not that many. A few of the first he wrote were based on fairy tales he had heard as a child. But very quickly, the dominant part of his output was fairy tales of his own invention. So that's the short answer. But I could say a bit more in addition to this, because we have in fact designed the course so in a way that we begin with one of Andersen's tales, the Tinderbox, which is based on a folk tale, which the origin of which is known in various European cultures. I think different versions you can find of this story, and then we move on to tales of Andersen's own invention, and more thematically complex tales and stories of his. So we do in fact, and you'll find out, we do highlight the similarities and differences between tales of Andersen's own invention and traditional folk tales. That's an important part of the course, and we also want to highlight the way that Andersen uses, because he didn't just invent fairy tales of his own, he really uses the fairy tale structure and basic elements of fairy tales in his storytelling, but these traditional elements, he twists them, manipulates them, puts them together in new ways. So that's a key entrance into Andersen as a writer of fairy tales, is simply to try and see what it is that what he does with the matrix of the folktale, so to speak. So I guess that was my answer to that one.
Yes. Then we have a question from Louisa Ellingham, and she asks, do you think that fairy tales, Andersen's as well as others, have their roots in mystical concepts? And if so, do you think that reintroduction of the tales in their purer form, that is not through Hollywood and other popular media, could help people in understanding the plight of the human soul?
Well, I think first of all, you have to find out, or I have to find out, what is meant by the term mystical. I take it that it refers to some kind of occult, esoteric tradition, which is certainly a tradition in Western culture and other cultures as well. I don't think that folk tales will have any root in that kind of tradition, and therefore my immediate answer might be no. I don't think that Andersen's tales have some roots, as I mentioned, in folk tales and in popular folk culture. I mean, Andersen was born into a social class in which storytelling, oral storytelling, was still practiced. So this is very much where he has got his basic early roots. But then, of course, he would become a famous writer. He would be in the company of the intellectual elite of his day in Denmark, and later on also in Europe. And this kind of occult, mystical tradition is an element of Western thought, philosophy, and so on. Certainly influenced certain romantic writers. So Andersen would be aware of this tradition, and some of his tales can be read in a way that they reflect ideas of this tradition. It's possible with some of them. But you could say The Little Mermaid, is that a story about a kind of spiritual journey? And of course you can read the story that way, but at a certain point, I think you will be more reading things into the story than out of it, so to speak.
Yeah.
But there was a very, very lively debate at Andersen's time about Christianity, about religion, the relationship between religion and science, and it was very much a time of transition and intellectual debate about such very fundamental things. And Andersen was very, very interested in these debates. And one of his novels, with a quite ambitious title, To Be or Not to Be, in fact, directly partakes in such a debate.
Yes, and one of the main characters is this Jewish girl who is extremely intellectual and debates a lot with the protagonist about spirituality and religion, very generally, not just Christianity, but religion in general. So there is a lot of debate going on. I'm not sure that Andersen is somehow advocating one particular version, or if he's just musing over all these different positions and these debates going on.
He is always experimenting and testing positions, intellectual, spiritual positions. You can't pinpoint him in one position.
No,
I think, but I mean, we could refer back to what you said as a response to the first question, Torsten, that literature, good literature, of course, helps us understanding ourselves and the human soul and existence, and that goes for Andersen, as well as for Shakespeare and
sure,
so many other writers as well. So,
as for whether the popular media or Hollywood is somehow a hindrance or doing something better, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that we can make this hierarchy between those kinds of modes.
There is a later question where we'll ask this very specifically.
Yeah, and then we'll get around to that again, I think.
But as a part of the module on the Little Mermaid, you can yourself reflect on similarities and differences between Andersen's original version and the Disney version.
Yeah,
and that's very interesting. I mean, one point you can make is that, in a way, Disney turns the Little Mermaid back into a folktale in certain ways, and that's quite interesting.
Yeah, so at the center, we don't have any kind of prejudice or anything against, or principal prejudice against these Disney versions at all, because they can be very interesting. They can do something completely new with these fairy tales. So they're interesting from a research point of view.
Certainly.
Next question is from Mandy Norman, asking, what do you think the definition of a fairy tale / fable is compared to any other story? And is there any modern fairy tales you can suggest would be of interest? Well, first of all, I would say that it's funny to see this slash between fairy tale and fable, because they are in themselves very, very separate, very distinguished, separate genres. The fable is this usually very short text that usually involves animals talking, behaving like humans, and where there is this clear moral at the end of the story that is usually spelled out, so you won't miss it. And that's not the case with fairy tales, not necessarily anyway. There can be, but when it comes to fairy tales, I would say that it's almost easier to define a folk tale, which has this oral origins and which can be pretty much about anything, but where you have these very typical, we will also get around to that in the course, that they have these very typical characters that move in some kind of set way in regards to each other. So there will usually be a protagonist that goes through some kind of tests and then ends up achieving something. So there are these structures when it comes to fairy tales that are pretty much set in regular folk tales anyway. And then when it comes to fairy tales like Hans Christian Andersen's, then you suddenly have a clear author who is writing them down and can basically take all the kinds of liberties that he or she wants to. But there are some, but given that they are presented as fairy tales and that they draw upon folktale material, there will usually be these kind of recognizable positions and these recognizable actions that makes them fairy tale-like. They will usually involve some kind of supernatural things happening, which can be which is almost always completely logical to the text. No one wonders when a gnome enters the scene in a fairy tale, or a witch for that matter. So it's kind of taken for granted that supernatural things can happen. And then you will, especially in the folktale fairy tales, you will usually not have a very deep psychology when it comes to the characters. There's no psychological depth. They are more or less these kind of stereotypical archetypes that are moved around on almost on a theater scene. So I would say that would be some sort of definition of the fairy tale.
It's a good question, because of course some of Andersen's tales have got animals as characters. And could appear to criticize human, you could say, all too human traits. So there are some of his tales are kind of fable-like. But often you'll find that the moral is quite complex or isn't really there, and he might even supply you with a mock moral. Like in a lesser-known tale called The Farm Cock and the Weathercock, or Weathervane. That's a good example. So you can look that up and find a mock moral.
Of course, one of the fairy tales, the more known fairy tales that are usually reduced to one point, you could mention The Emperor's New Clothes, which is almost has this fable-like character, that power is corrupt and it takes an innocent mind to expose that corruption. That would be like one of the fairy tales that I've usually made into this one unison point.
And then, are there any modern fairy tales you can suggest would be of interest?
That is actually a question that I've asked a couple of people, because I myself can't really think of any really well-known writers of fairy tales at the moment, not like internationally well-known. There are a lot of fantasy writers that resemble or are drawing upon this fairy tale universe. You could mention Harry Potter, for instance, which is set in this fairy tale-like world, but at the same time it has also a lot of similarities towards traditional teen literature, where you have a group of people a group of young people, teenagers, working against some kind of evil antagonist and working things out in concert. So these genres are really, this fantasy genre is actually drawing upon a lot of different traditions, including the fairy tale tradition, I would say. There's also a lot of psychological development and a lot of individuality in the characters, which you wouldn't usually find in a fairy tale. So I'm not pretty sure that I can think of any really well-known writers.
No, and also once you move away from folk tales and talk about fairy tales, this can be a very, very broad concept. So in that way, it's not that easy to answer the question. No. Then we've got a question from Rob Walton, and he asks, is there a single element which distinguishes Andersen's fairy tales from those of other celebrated European writers, collectors, such as Perrault or the Brothers Grimm? It's another very good question. I think a very brief answer would be no, because there is not one single element. But I think I will return to what I said a little earlier, that Andersen is in fact using the elements, formulas, structures of folk tales, also when writing tales of his own invention. But he's twisting them and manipulating them, using them for his own purposes, his own artistic purposes. So that is the main difference. He is simply, you could say, he adopts these elements, picks them up, puts them in his toolbox, so to speak, and then things start to happen. And you're invited in this course to reflect on what actually happens.
Yeah. I was going to say, we might not want to give too extensive an answer to this one, because that is an integrated part of the
integrated part of the course.
Yeah.
And you will be encouraged to compare tales of Andersen with original folk tales.
Yeah.
As a part of the course. Yes.
Then there's another question from Hanny de Jong Wubben. Are fairy tales with a lot of violence a problem for young children? And that's a really interesting question, because that is something that comes up occasionally when it comes to fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen, and in general with older types of literature for children. Is it still somehow suitable for children? Has the pedagogical values changed so much that these are in fact unsuitable for children? I don't necessarily think so, and neither does some of the researchers of children's literature that I've talked with. First and foremost, they think that it could be very educational to be presented with expressions, artistic expressions from other times in history. That is what is called, I think it's called positive strangeness, with this scientific term, where you are somehow motivated into getting into the mindset of a different period in time, and not just presented with things that are exactly like you are the way you are used to. So that is one argument for doing this. As to the violence, especially in Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, there can sometimes be some kind of violence, but you'll often notice that it's done with some kind of twist. One of the researchers of children's literature that I talked with, she said specifically that she thinks that Andersen is too often domesticized or made cuter than he is. Oftentimes it happens through the illustrations that are done, that you will most oftenly illustrate the most cute passages of the text and avoid those that seem more violent. What she says is that that is exactly why we are not making the children watch the news. That is why we present these themes to children through this aesthetic form, through art, because aesthetics, as she says it, is a distance. It's a way of saying things indirectly, through metaphors, through allegories, or through some kind of indirect distance or way of speaking about things. One good example is the end of the Tinderbox, which you will also be reading, where basically the entire court is wiped out. But they are done so, it says that the dogs are throwing them into the air, and they're falling down and breaking almost to pieces like toys.
Yeah.
So a child will visualize this as toys falling to pieces, instead of this bloodbath that it could also be visualized as. And that is because of this, I would argue, this aesthetic distance, or this distance that aesthetics basically is, this indirect way of talking about things. And that is why I, as well as these researchers, think that children are actually able to handle a lot of very, very big questions if it is done properly.
Yeah, and a lot of violence.
Yeah.
Because I think you're right that it's the way that violence is presented is the decisive factor.
Yeah.
I read one of the Icelandic sagas aloud to my son when he wasn't that old, the one called the Saga of the Volsungs. And the mortality rate per page is pretty high in this story. And we joked about that. Only 2 people died on page 17. It wasn't that much. But it's narrated in a very matter-of-fact way.
Yeah.
So it's not really scary. Whereas a certain phase of the story, 2 of the characters are kind of outlawed, and they live in the forest like wolves. And this is not a metaphor or an image.
No.
They literally become walls in this passage.
Yeah.
So the distinction between human and animal is not very clear at this point in the story, and that is potentially disturbing.
Yeah.
And can be scary and uncanny.
Yeah.
Much more than all the deaths.
Yeah.
At
Yeah.
every page.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's in the way it is presented, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is from Teresa Paris. She asks, apart from creating drama, is the intense suffering in the fairy tales so necessary? That is, to an extent, that is a matter of taste, you could say. But I would say that the fairy tales is about very, very big questions. It's about life and death, and a lot of really big questions about how to grow up, how to make it in the world, and how to overcome suffering. So I would say that it is not necessarily a place for the more everyday feelings and the complexities of everyday feelings. That is somehow better carried out in a very long novel or something like that. But when it comes to fairy tales, it's a very short. Typically it's very short texts about really, really big issues. So I would say that to meet that artistic goal, it is necessary with this kind of, not necessarily intense suffering, but very, very big emotions.
Yeah.
It's a melodramatic genre, I would say, but not in the sense that people are necessarily having large emotional reactions, but that it's just really everything in its extreme somehow.
Suffering is a part of the human condition.
Yeah.
So it's a big theme in literature and in Andersen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right, so then Simone V.
Yeah, asks a couple of questions.
Yeah, there's a series of questions from Simone. The first one is, do you think that authors of fairy tales are influenced by personal events, and that writing supplies the outlet and perhaps outcome they would have liked to have seen in the real world for situations they have encountered personally or observed as a bystander? Well, I would be a bit wary of saying that writing literature is an outlet. It might be, of course, but it's difficult to judge. But certainly authors are influenced by what they experience and what they see. It would be silly to say otherwise. And it's certainly the case with Andersen that he draws a lot upon his own experiences as a child and later in life as well.
Yeah.
But what is interesting is, of course, what he does with it. And I think you could say for good or great authors, the two main sources will be their own experiences and all the pre-existing literature they've been reading.
Yeah.
And this is where Andersen has not always been given sufficient credit for all that he has read, and the way all that he has read is reflected in what he writes. So his awareness of genre, for example, is very, very acute, and that is based on reading, and not on his personal life.
No, he was extremely well read, but I think that there can maybe be said to exist this misconception of him, given his poor roots, the way he grew up. I recently talked to a focus group interview where all the people were very surprised that he was even educated. A lot of people thought that he was this completely uneducated, poor child that got the gift of inspiration and writing. And it's also a common misconception, as I recall it, that he was dyslexic, which I don't believe to be the case, because he was very well read. And the fairy tales aren't the most you could say, intellectually ambitious texts that he did. Not
at the first glance.
Not at the no, and he didn't. That was not where he intended to discuss intellectual themes so explicit as he does in the novels. In the novels, he is very explicitly addressing German philosophy, the debate climate of Copenhagen in the 19th century. He is referencing a lot of earlier literature, a lot of Shakespeare, a lot of Goethe. So he was very well read, and he was constantly debating with himself and other people in this intellectual environment in his texts.
Yes, and I think, of course, as a cultural icon internationally, Andersen's life is as much a part of the myth about him as his fairy tales, and he kind of prepared the ground for that, so to speak. I mean, the autobiographies he wrote, and calling one of them the fairy tale of my life.
Yeah.
And, so it's not so strange that people often make that connection. And I think a very good example, for example, the last module will be on the tale, the red shoes. And Andersen had told some of his friends about his own confirmation in Odense. He just received a pair of new shoes. He was very proud of them, and he maybe thought more about the shoes than God during the ceremony, and he felt a bit guilty about that. And when he told that to some of his friends, they said, "Aha, that's why you wrote the red shoes then." And first Andersen said, "No, those two things have nothing to do with each other." But later on he found out, well, that was an easy way of explaining why he had written the story, so he kind of adopted this explanation, and then it was also his explanation. But his first reaction was, no, there's no connection between the two.
So he paved the way for people to perceive him like that, to perceive his works like that. The next question is, how do you feel about dramatizations of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, such as Disney film interpretations? And secondly, do you think there should be more reference to the original stories in the promotions and advertising of said films? If we take the last part of the question first, then I actually think that there is enough reference to the original stories in the promotions and advertising of the films. If we take a case such as Disney's Frozen, the Disney studios, I find, all the time emphasize that it's inspired by Hans Christian Andersen, even though I think that they've taken the story so far away from the original that it is, I wouldn't necessarily have made the connection.
No, and that's why it's really instructive to compare the two versions of The Little Mermaid, Andersen's original and the Disney adaptation, whereas comparing Frozen and the Snow Queen, they're so different that you won't really learn anything from doing that.
We've tried it now for some time, and we haven't really come up with anything at the moment. But yeah, I would say that interpreting these fairy tales and rearranging them and recontextualizing them is actually somehow staying really true to the original work method of Andersen, and also the oral storytelling back when it was folktale material, because they would constantly be put in some kind of new context. They would constantly be modified and be set in relation to a new situation. The person telling the story would add something and forget something. So I don't necessarily see a problem with doing this. It's just breathing new life into the fairy tales, saying something different with them, and I think that's interesting.
Yeah. Then the next question from Simone is: are Andersen's tales taught as part of the Danish syllabus in schools, from youngsters, infant schools, to teenagers, secondary schools across Denmark? I think one should be aware that the individual teacher has got quite a lot of freedom in the Danish school educational system. We haven't got a national syllabus or curriculum, so it will be up to the individual teacher whether Andersen is on the syllabus or not, to a certain extent, because he is one of the writers which are recommended strongly. But it's still it will be the teacher's choice if they read Andersen's fairy tales. Which tales they read will be up to the teacher. So I don't think we can be more specific than that. That most people will meet Andersen as part of primary and secondary education in Danish schools. I think.
Definitely. So in practice, I think it's taught all over the country, but there's no systematic guidelines or anything. There is this national cultural canon that was made some years ago where the Little Mermaid is on, but that's a recommendation, I think. More or less.
Yes.
Next question, also from Simone, is Hans Christian Andersen still revered by the young in Denmark today, or is there a gap in popularity due to modern day leisure activities? I think I can safely say that he's still known. I don't know about revered, but I think that almost everyone in Denmark knows about Hans Christian Andersen. And given the fact that there is a lot of his fairy tales that have worked their way into everyday language, so young people will say that it's one feather that was made into 5 hens or something like that. That's an expression when people are exaggerating a story that young people will say. But I think that's just my personal opinion, that Hans Christian Andersen will, and the works of him will endure. I think that they will be updated, they will be made into computer games or whatever. They will be made interactive 3D stories about him, and they at the museum here in Odense, they are making this big new fairy tale house, trying to really modernize the dissemination
but it touches upon an important question, namely, did Andersen write his fairy tales only for young people?
Oh yeah, yes, that's true.
And it's a question we will return to.
Yes.
So perhaps we should leave it there.
I think so.
For the time being.
Yes. I can add though that my daughter, who is 2 months old now, just got her first complete works of Hans Christian Andersen in her name giving celebration. So it's still a popular gift at name givings and christenings. So. I think it's an intention from the older generations that the young people should be aware of his works. And the next
lot of these
question,
books are given in this way, and some of them might also be read.
You can hope so. When were your first encounters of Hans Christian Andersen, and how has he influenced your lives? I think we can safely skip that question maybe, because that is actually a part of the course. So one of the first steps, we will give an introduction to ourselves, and we'll tell you how we first encountered Hans Christian Andersen.
That question is answered there.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right. Yes.
The next one is, and that's the last one from Simone. Traveling appeared to be a big interest of Andersen's. From his sketches, and was keeping a diary. Some sketches had diary entries beneath them. Do you think this could help writers today? I'm not sure about the last one. The last question. I think that's up to the individual writer to decide. But it's true that Andersen did sketch a lot, and he was also doing a lot of paper clips. He worked in a lot of media, and especially when he was traveling in Italy on his first big trip in 1833 to 34, he actually developed this sketching practice, and he became more and more satisfied with it. And that would usually reflect back on his writing, which he would oftentimes refer to as making sketches. drawing sketches. Whenever he was going to describe something to a friend in a letter, he wouldn't write, I will describe this to you, but I will paint this for you, or I will sketch it for you. He also has this fabulous little collection of stories told by the moon called Picture Book Without Pictures. And in general, he had this, I think he had this very cross-media thinking where writing directly phased over into sketching and reverse.
Quite a number of famous writers were in fact also visual artists. Sometimes you know about it and sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
But more than you would think. And I don't think people think of Kafka as a visual artist, but he makes some very fascinating drawings.
Oh, I would like to see them. They must be gory, disturbing.
They are, but in a very subdued way. But yeah. Right, let's leave it at that.
Yes.
Yeah. And then 3 questions from Helen McCarthy. The first one goes, who were the original fairy tales written for? So here we return to that question. I think the first volume of fairy tales that Andersen wrote, he did that as a way of kind of testing whether there would be a market or not. And the volume was called Fairy Tales Narrated or Told for Children. So he certainly had children in mind.
Yeah.
But I think right from the start, he was very aware if this was going to be a success, something he would carry on with, he would also indirectly have to address an adult audience. Therefore, one Danish scholar has come up with a very good way of putting it, saying that there is a double articulation in Andersen right from the beginning. That the immediate story can be understood by children, but there is always an element of humor or other elements which are more accessible to the adult, presumably reading aloud. And this did become a success. I also think that Andersen sensed that he had hit upon something, a format, a genre, which would give him unlimited possibilities. So therefore he carried on, and gradually he skipped the 4 children.
Yeah, and very tellingly.
Yeah, and it became fairy tales and stories, new fairy tales. That would be some of the titles for his later volumes. So it was never Andersen's intention that what he wrote in the genre should be only for children. And some of his later tales are not for children at all.
No, no.
I would say that goes for the majority in a way. So it's important to be aware of that.
Yeah, and I can't remember where, but at some point he directly says so, that he meets something who was under the impression that his fairy tales were only for children and clearly hadn't gotten this double articulation. He doesn't say that, of course, but he says that they hadn't discovered that there's also a lot of things for the grown-ups there. And in To Be or Not to Be, he actually calls the fairy tale this kind of perfect genre. It can do, he can do anything with it. It can do everything.
It gave him a freedom he didn't have within any other format.
Yeah,
and he made sure he used that.
Yeah.
And the next questions kind of linked to the first one. Do you think the same audience, age range, and demographic are still reading his work? We have touched a bit upon it.
Yeah.
So the audience shouldn't be limited to a specific age, would be my first response. But I don't think Andersen is as widely read in Denmark as some of you might presume.
No.
And only a limited amount of his tales and stories. I mean, you can come up with a lot of titles that people will simply not recognize.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a handful of stories that are really well known, and I think that
all the same ones which are internationally known.
Yes,
the greatest hits, you could say.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that people probably stop reading them when they grow old, and then I think a lot of people just feel that they know them so well that they almost know them by heart.
Yeah.
These 5, 7 classics. Yeah. And then the last question: how do young boys now react to his fairy tales when they are exposed to such a lot of alternative, supercharged, all-action heroes and villains?
We're back to modern fairy tales.
Yes, yeah, that is true. I don't. It would be very speculative for me to say anything about how young boys react to fairy tales. What I will say is that it turns out that fairy tales aren't entirely incompatible with these supercharged all-action heroes and villains. It turns out there are a lot of remakes being done right now, and modernizations of especially the folktale material. So it turns out that a lot of this folktale material actually lends itself to these Marvel-like action movies.
Yeah.
So
but I don't think young boys have more problems than young girls.
No.
I just think they will find Andersen's story strange.
Yeah.
If they've been raised on Harry Potter and the like, Andersen will not meet the expectations from a modern audience, expectations about what a fairy tale should be like.
No,
I don't think so. And I think the Snow Queen, the two tales adapted by Disney are very good examples. The Little Mermaid, the Sea Witch is a very ambiguous figure in Andersen's original tale, but she's the condition that for the metamorphosis of the mermaid. Therefore, she's important in the story, but she's completely ambiguous. Whereas Ursula in the Disney adaptation, she's turned into a regular villain.
Yeah.
And a similar kind of ending. If Frozen had been more based on Andersen's story, that would have been a very big problem with the ending of the Snow Queen, because there's no final showdown.
No.
I mean, when Gerda finally reaches the castle and finds Kai, the Snow Queen is away on an expedition somewhere.
Yeah.
So evil is never confronted.
No. No, and never stopped. And they also just they return to their original.
Yeah.
So you can discuss whether there is any kind of development in that story.
So the absence of all action heroes and proper villains, is a basic fact in Andersen that will surprise a modern audience, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
The next question is from Ryan Straker. It's quite long, but I'll give it a go. Hi, has anybody ever discussed issues of social class in the works of Hans Christian Andersen? I noticed in my first reading of The Red Shoes that Karen is hypnotized not only by the red shoes themselves, but by the allure of a seemingly refined class that attracts her. I interpreted the story as a tale of people's attitudes towards social standing, social mobility, and the ugliness of social class as a concept. There's an added part. I think in today's world, increasingly widening and explicit political dichotomies of left and right, Leave and Remain, Clinton and Trump, are betraying a universal undercurrent of class resentment. I would love to know if anybody has ever explored issues of social class with regards to Andersen's work.
Yes, that's a very, very good question.
Yes.
I mean, Andersen was very, very aware of his own humble background. You could say he originated from a class even lower than the regular working class. But we're so early in in the 19th century that this distinction is also a bit difficult to make.
Yeah.
But he came from very, very humble origins. He never forgot that, and he was not permitted to forget it.
No.
He never felt that he was absolutely accepted by the elite.
No.
Rightly or wrongly, but he always felt that he was invited into people's houses and so on, but always made to feel that he didn't quite belong.
Yeah.
So the issue of social class is very important in Andersen, and some scholars have certainly written very good things about that aspect. I don't think they've been translated into English, so I'm afraid I can't really recommend any particular study.
No.
But it's interesting drawing this parallel to today, because I think one can only agree that there is a strong class-related resentment, which is ruling the day in disguised forms. So it's not a theme that we are beyond in any way.
No, definitely not.
It's sadly present.
And it does permeate the work of Andersen, this attention to class issues, where he tends to side with the ones being marginalized in this class, this very intricate class system, which was also in some sort of crisis, you could say, during the 19th century. It was somehow being, there was this rise of the bourgeoisie, and there were these people like Andersen who made these weird risings through the classes, but were never quite accepted into the upper classes. So it's definitely and Andersen is always solidary with the marginalized position.
Yeah.
It shows in the fairy tales. It also shows in the novels. I've talked about To Be or Not to Be, where you have this Jewish girl called Esther, who is always presenting all the very intellectual deliberations. That it's the same case in the novel Just a Fiddler, where you have this protagonist, also a Jewish girl who is also very intelligent, but obviously marginalized by the social class system in Denmark at the time. So, or outside of it, like Andersen himself was probably a kind of an outsider, had this side glance to the goings on.
Yeah, so many of his protagonists are outsiders.
Yeah,
in one way or another.
So
yes.
Next question.
Maybe one should add that the issue about social class, that's not the only reason why Andersen is very, very popular in China to this day. But certainly, I mean, he was maybe the only Western writer who survived the Cultural Revolution, and that was because he could be read with his social agenda.
Yeah.
And Chairman Mao, or however you would refer to him, he adored Andersen.
Yeah.
So
his favorite fairy tale was The Little Match Girl, because he thought it was this. He interpreted it as this really harsh critique of capitalist society. So he could be used for this really leftist communist system. The next question is from Joan Greenleaf, and she asks, is it interesting that, like the English Charles Dodgson / Lewis Carroll, Hans Christian Andersen did not have children of his own? Was he close to the children of his family or friends? I see the caption of the painting. That must be the painting in the course. It's a painting of Hans Christian Andersen reading aloud to a group of children. I see the caption of the painting shows him as reading to the children of the artist. Is that based on fact or imagination? And I believe that's based on fact.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Andersen, he dined out almost every evening, visiting bourgeois families, and part of what he would be doing, or his way of thanking for the meal, would be to read aloud to the children, and I think he enjoyed that.
Yeah.
So he did that a lot.
Yeah, I think also it's safe to say that he would sometimes maybe use them as kind of focus groups or something, trying out new ideas, seeing how the children responded to it. But it's true, though, that he never married and he never got any children of his own. But he had contact to a lot of children of these bourgeois families.
And then when he told or read stories, he would also do paper cuts, drawings, and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he was quite the entertainer. Then there is a question from Maria Strani-Potts asking, are the Disney productions good or bad for the comprehension of the fairy tale? And it's a tricky question because from a research point of view anyway, it's not very productive to put it up in that kind of way, either or. It is very interesting that these fairy tales are used and reused in all kinds of different contexts. And I think that the Disney productions are very interesting, as we do in the course, to hold up as comparisons to the original fairy tales, seeing just as the original fairy tales are interesting to put up in relation to their folktale counterparts. So we can actually see this kind of progression where some kind of story is worked and reworked. And then you can almost see like this line of themes going back from folktale material up until Disney, because even though The Little Mermaid is an original story by Hans Christian Andersen, there has been stories about mermaids before that he has probably been inspired by.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily think you can say that it's good or bad. It can be some kind of different morale or some kind of different expression that you can either agree with or not agree with, but
the only problem is if, for example, Disney's version of The Little Mermaid kind of obscures the original as a cultural icon, or whatever way you say it, but that you think that Andersen's original is like the Disney version, which is quite different in a number of ways.
Yeah.
So I think if the original is kind of forgotten or replaced by the adaptation, that's would be an unlucky side effect.
Yeah, that's true.
But
do you think that's the case?
I think in certain contexts that might be the case. That when people think of Andersen and The Little Mermaid, they think of the Disney version and they think they know Andersen's story.
Yeah, that is, of course, that is a concern. If the newer versions start to eclipse the older and completely overshadow the
a good word.
Then that's unfortunate.
Yeah. We haven't got the same problem with Frozen, I think, because it's directly states that this is loosely based on Andersen's original. So some people then maybe want to find out about the original.
Yeah.
And then it's quite okay.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, then we've got a question from Dennis Garvey. Does what we call the fairy tale genre have a definite point of origin, or has the form always existed as part of the human narrative DNA? It's a nice way of putting it, I think. I think the answer is very much yes, because myths and fairy tales, what Torsten talked about, is these very basic stories that we know them from all cultures and from as far back as we can dig, so to speak. So fairy tales, myths, etc., very much seems to be a part of the human narrative DNA.
Yeah,
seems quite obvious.
And if you're looking at it from a literary historical point of view, I don't think that anybody actually knows the origin of the folk tales. No, it's because it's orally transmitted, so we can't really trace it.
No.
As far back as it goes. So Sheila Ash asks, until recently, there have been few young children in my wider families have kept up with modern children's authors. I have two questions. One, are there any modern children's writers who are noticeably influenced by Hans Christian Andersen? If we take that one first. I don't know of any international writers of fairy tales that are, well, I don't know of a lot of international contemporary writers of fairy tales, but certainly not anyone who are directly influenced by Hans Christian Andersen.
There are a couple of quite new Danish writers, who draw upon Andersen, but they haven't been translated yet. So again, it would be pointless to recommend them in this context.
I think a lot of it had been taken over by fantasy writers, perhaps. So the second question is, does the craze for vampire stories, fantasy works, have any roots traceable to the works of Hans Christian Andersen? If I should give that one a go, I would say it's very interesting that there is this neo-Gothic tendency within popular culture, and especially within popular culture for teenagers and young people. But it is Gothic and what you would call dark romantic literature that it's influenced by. And there I'm thinking about Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley and writers like that of, you know, proper Gothic fiction. It's mostly those that are the inspiration for Twilight and these kind of stories. When it comes to these Marvel-like writings of old classic fairy tales or folk tales, then it is precisely folk tales. It's the Little Red Riding Hood and it's Hansel and Gretel who are all of a sudden vampire hunters or something like that. So we have folktale material and Gothic literature. And they somehow bypass the work of Andersen. That's somehow exactly not what he was specifically doing.
No.
So
he's influenced by Romanticism, certainly. It's kind of a starting point. But other aspects of Romanticism, there might be Gothic elements in some of Andersen's tales and novels, but you have to look closely in order to find them. So I don't think there's any. I completely agree that these modern vampire stories and other fantasy works, they don't draw upon Andersen.
No,
I don't think so.
And the only one I know, the only dark, I agree with you completely. It would be a much longer discussion.
You can't find a Gothic piece.
No.
You can find Gothic passages within certain works.
And I would also say that the Gothic aspect of Andersen is more along the lines of, I'm going out on a limb maybe, but more along the lines of Edgar Allan Poe and these kind of psychological dark elements, more than it's about vampires or those kind of monsters. That it has something to do with like I don't know, maybe even psychological darkness or something like that. But maybe that's,
well, Poe was of course accused of kind of aping Gothic German ghost stories. And he was very offended by this accusation. So he wrote something like, "My terror," didn't use the word horror, but terror. "My terror is not of Germany, it's of the soul."
Oh, yeah.
And perhaps Andersen could say something like that.
I think we have another question from Sarah Puddle. Could you kindly discuss why you think Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales have such a universal appeal? Do you think this bears any relationship to Jung's idea of a collective unconscious?
Well, it's difficult to determine something like that. My immediate reaction would be kind of a no, in the sense that I think what is not so compatible between a theory or psychology like Jung's and the study of literature is that the Jungian approach would often be to beforehand determine the meaning of a given symbol or something which can be read as a symbol. So you kind of start reading with a lot of presuppositions about how to interpret things, whereas where I would like to keep a more open mind, and if something can be read as a symbol, then your idea about what this symbol means should be influenced by the context, by the text in which it appears. So before you move outside the text and consult, for example, Jung, you should do a careful reading first. Yeah. But whether there be something like a collective unconscious or not, I can't really answer. I can't really answer that question. It's a very big one.
Yeah, but what you might say is some kind of speaking of also when we've been speaking about the narratological, this kind of what was called this narrative DNA of people, that it might be a quite universal structure, that we are dealing with a protagonist that is somehow going out into the world, overcoming something and achieving something sometimes, because not always necessarily. So there are these kind of more or less universal structures that are not necessarily Jungian. I'd agree.
And to return to a former question about mystical elements, it was perhaps Jung who came up with the phrase individuation, but this way of thinking about human psychology, existence, etc., originated before Jung, and in occult mystical traditions. You find many versions of this kind of individuation idea.
Yeah,
and it also influenced certain certain kinds of Christianity at Andersen's time were influenced by such ideas, as well as by writers drawing upon such ideas, and some very much, and some still understand Goethe as writing in this tradition. So again, Andersen would be aware of ideas of individuation.
Yeah,
and some of the stories reflect that in certain ways, but that doesn't immediately tell you how to read them.
No. And returning to the question of the universality or the universal appeal, I think you could say that I don't know if I think there are some universal dilemmas and discussions of ethical problems in Hans Christian Andersen that somehow transcends cultures. But also, I think that his appeal to us today might have to do with the fact that Andersen wasn't writing in a time that is so far removed from where we are at. He's not in the Middle Ages, so you don't have to be familiar with that kind of worldview. He wrote on in this transition period where the Western cultures were entering modernity. So he writes with the same insecurities and ambivalences and doubts that we, to some extent, still have today. So he is kind of very relatable, I think, or his stories are very relatable because they are written on the threshold of this period that we're still in.
Yes, certainly.
Next question is from Sheila Ash, who asks, how does his tales relate to the folk tales from other non-European countries?
It's a good question. I would say that at a first glance, and we've talked a bit about this before, Andersen is rooted in a Western folktale tradition.
Yeah.
And it's the elements of this tradition that he uses and twists and so on. But then again, the tales, the folk tales, we connect to this tradition. I mean, they've traveled across cultures too.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure there is a European folk tradition.
No.
Which is not influenced by other cultures than European culture.
And you could say for this specific period in time, I don't know that Andersen is very influenced by it, but he knew of 1001 Nights.
He certainly did.
He certainly knew about that. And the Aladdin figure was like this romantic ideal in Denmark, and I believe Germany too at the time, or maybe it was specifically in Denmark that
very much in Denmark
that the artist had to be this Aladdin character.
And the whole idea about the genius is influenced by this Aladdin figure, or its interpretation of the Aladdin
because
figure or character.
It's an interpretation of an adaptation of the because the 1001 Nights all only existed in a very heavily edited form at that time. All the erotic parts were edited out, and so it was a very westernized adapted version of, but nonetheless, Hans Christian Andersen knew about it and probably references it. Next question is Maria Potts. Good morning. Is Disney Productions beneficial to the fairy tale and readers? Would the author welcome Disney Productions? I think we've already covered the first part. Yes. As to whether the author would welcome Disney Productions, that is pure speculation.
It's pure speculation. I guess he would be skeptical.
Yeah.
Again, the idea that Disney are for children and young people.
Yeah.
You can draw a parallel to his own reaction to being seen as a writer of fiction for children.
Yeah, he was against that, and in general, any kind of, sort of narrowing down of the works into some specific purpose, or I think he would be apprehensive towards that.
I think so.
However, he also himself clearly states several times that you never know what will happen to your works and how it will be read in the time after you. So he's also aware of the fact that after he's produced a work of art, it kind of gets a life on its own. Yeah, it disseminates. Yeah. But directly asked what he felt, I think he would be apprehensive.
Mm-hmm. And there are a question from Walton. 2 questions, in fact. How does the way Andersen is regarded by Danes differ from the way he is regarded elsewhere? Is there a difference apart from the obvious pride in him as a Danish writer? That's a good question. A number of stories are specifically popular in Denmark, and more or less this will coincide with his international popularity.
Yeah.
But I think there might be one story, and this is not very flattering for a little country, what I'm going to say. I think there's one story which is extremely popular in Denmark, and maybe not very well known elsewhere. And that's Klods. I've forgotten the. I think
it's
not easy to translate.
No, one of our
clawed hands. Or something
clumsy
like that.
hands.
Clumsy hands.
Yeah.
About this crazy idiot.
Yeah.
Who's completely spontaneous and straightforward and wins the heart of the princess on that account. And he's seen as the prototypical Danish hero.
Yeah.
Because we are so spontaneous and innovative and unsnobbish, and
and
so he's taken to be emblematic of the Danish national character.
Yeah, and he also mocks
authority,
knowledge, institutions.
Yeah, that could take us back to another former question.
Yeah, but yeah, that's probably true. I think that Hans Christian Andersen has probably made that is at least one argument I've heard, that he's paved the way for well, again, children's literature to be more dark and be more violent, be a bit more wild than it would perhaps have been otherwise, and than it is perhaps in other countries. But I think that maybe that's a Scandinavian thing in general, that the Scandinavian children's literature can often get quite dark and melancholic.
Then the next question, or extension of the question, goes: is there something quintessentially Danish about his writing?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say in the way you, not along the lines of thinking about national characters or something like that. I think the language, I mean, there's something very specific about Andersen, which is often lost in translation, which is his very peculiar way of telling stories, his way of narrating, which is also extremely influenced by Danish as it was spoken at the time. And that is, of course, quintessentially Danish, the language. And a lot of his humor and irony derives or is insolubly linked to the Danish language, and creates all sorts of problems when it is to be translated.
And it often comes across in small side remarks or something like that, that are very subtle.
But some of his tales, and they are almost untranslatable, some of the very short ones, and often later short ones, are almost narrated by everyday language, because it's idioms, phrases, sayings, that such phrases and sayings animate the whole thing, so to speak. And that's quintessentially Danish.
Yeah, that's true. Then there is a question from Barbara Miratabi. Are his stories ever as scary as, for example, some grim fairy tales?
Well, a few of them are.
That depends on how you define scary, because there are some of them that are, I would say, a lot more disturbing than the grim fairy tales. But the grim fairy tales can tend to be very violent and very brutal. But again, some of the early fairy tales, like Big Klaus and Little Klaus, and to some extent the Tinderbox, are very grim-like, with the violence and with this this very graphic and a disdain towards being violent. But then I would say that that some of the later ones, like The Shadow or The Story of a Mother, are even more gut-wrenching and disturbing and thought-provoking than the grim stories
certainly
can get. I don't know if you have anything to...
Again, they are scary on a more psychological level. A level you wouldn't find in for natural reasons.
Of course.
Then a question from an unknown person. When did
it's in Danish.
It's in Danish. When did Andersen die? Did he have any offspring? He died in 1875, and he didn't have any offspring.
No. So that's very easy to answer. Yes.
Then a question from Tricia Foot. I would like to know, what was Hans Christian Andersen's inspiration? What made him write?
That's always a
well,
question.
I think he had the urge to write from early on. He started writing very early. I think listening to stories, as a child was very formative.
Yeah.
So he became. So it's hearing stories. He also at a quite early age read writers like Goethe and Shakespeare.
And also, I can't remember what Walter Scott. He was really fond of Walter Scott. Yeah. So yeah, he would have been, the people would have read to him, and he would have been reading himself. And he was also a very artistic child from the beginning. Yeah. He sang when he was a small child, and he wanted to do ballet when he
had the urge to express himself right from the start.
Yeah. And then it turned into writing.
Yeah, predominantly.
Yeah.
But then again,
yes, of course, he also had other outlets.
Yes.
So Sheila Ash wants to know, what would be his contemporary writers? Well, he was, if that's what the question is, he was very deeply embedded into a artistic literary environment in Denmark at that time. He knew a lot of painters and a lot of writers. He knew a lot of intellectuals within the Romantic period. He visited them all the time. He would send sketches or drafts to one of his good friends, Ingemann, who was in the city of Sorø.
Danish writer.
Yeah, Danish writer.
Not really known outside of Denmark.
No, but he was really central to like the Romantic movement in Denmark. He had this little Romantic center in Sorø, this little
a
town
center
in Denmark.
outside Copenhagen.
Yes,
notably.
Yeah.
In fact, all the really good authors from this period did not originate in Copenhagen.
No,
but came from the outskirts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he was very well read in, as you said, Goethe, Walter Scott. He liked E.T.
And all the German romanticism.
Yeah.
And he met Tieck and Camus in person.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he met Dickens.
Yeah.
I don't think he met Walter Scott.
No, I don't think so
but
either.
He visited Scotland, but it was like a bit of a pilgrimage.
Yeah.
So this is the country of Scott.
Yeah. A late question from Liz Pearl. Was it an unusual move for Hans Christian Andersen to create entirely new tales with a similar structure to traditionally orally transmitted fairy tales, rather than creating a variation on those old tales? We see so many versions of Cinderella, for example, yet Hans Andersen's stories seem to have begun a new tradition rather than sourcing an old one.
I think that's very well formulated, very acute. And I think it's true.
Yeah.
That he's doing something unprecedented.
Yes.
With, you could say, some very well-known raw material.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he becomes somehow, he takes it further and further away from this wellspring where he started.
I think in a certain way you can perhaps compare Andersen to David Bowie in doing something with known raw material, which is absolutely unprecedented, and which depends on an extreme awareness of genre, the ability to identify all the elements, structures, and then being able to play with them and put them together in new ways. So something rich and strange occurs.
Yeah, we have to remember that Andersen was really very, very well aware what he did when he did the fairy tales, and in his novels, which are very, very complex romantic works of fiction, they almost always have very intricate plots, a lot of characters. So he was very well, he was very used to orchestrating a very large and very, very difficult scheme or narrative or plot. So he is very aware of what he's doing in the smaller fairy tales as well.
Yeah.
And there's
a question from Alan Brennan. Would Andersen have seen himself as part of a Germanic Scandinavian oral storytelling tradition, or a specifically Danish tradition, or perhaps a wider European tradition? I very much think that the latter is the case. Andersen was very much a universalist.
Yeah.
And I think the way he would be thinking about such questions would be in line with certain aspects of German Romanticism, which was always, which was also universalist, like Goethe was. The idea of world literature, Weltliteratur in German, originates at this time. You can find it in Goethe, but also some of the German Romanticists, which came immediately after Goethe.
Yeah.
And Andersen would have the same. And you can quote texts. I mean, Andersen is very excited by the Trans-Siberian Railroad, because this will bring the Asian and European culture in closer contact, and this will give so much more material for writing literature.
Yeah.
So the more influences from all parts of the world, the better.
And he's excited about the telegraph between Europe and North America. So he was very interested in this hodgepodge of cultures mixing together. And and I would also say in the fairy tales, it's mostly, like you said, in the language that you find something specifically Danish, because otherwise it could could take place in all kinds of different settings and cultures and time and ages, basically. Then we have a comment from Francis Ainsley, who is adding a PS. The question came up about any modern adult fairy tale writers. I'd mention A Portable Shelter by Kirsty Logan, which is very good. So that recommendation, yes, thank you. We can just pass that recommendation on.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are a lot of fairy tale writers and writers of literature that are inspired by the fairy tale tradition, but none as well known as good old Andersen.
Have we got any more questions?
Then,
no. Well, it's also just a few minutes left.
Yes.
So I guess we arrived at the end for today.
Yes.
But thank you very much for your attention and all the intriguing questions. And we hope you'll enjoy the course, and we look forward to the next live session.
Yes. It was November 21st. Yeah. And remember, during the course, if any questions arise, then put them down and send them to us so we can address them in the next session.
Yes. So thank you.
Thank you very much.